Maggie Calloway knelt in the suffocating dark of the devil's throat, her fingers trembling as she brushed the grime off a skeletal hand, still clutching a rusted brass compass. The needle didn't point north. It spun in frantic, rhythmic circles, mimicking the heartbeat pulsing through the very stone of the mountain. Beside the corpse lay a tattered tracking vest, identical to the one she was wearing. The name Calloway, stitched into the fabric in her mother's handwriting. Above her, the frantic screams of the townspeople were suddenly cut short by a sound like a great bell tolling deep underground, vibrating through her teeth until they bled. She realized then that the silence wasn't a curse or a predator. It was a dinner bell. As the cave entrance collapsed, sealing her in with the remains of the man she thought had abandoned her, Maggie looked at the smooth black stones where her father's eyes should have been and understood the horrific price of the mountain's protection. The land didn't want a warden. It wanted a fresh anchor, and it had been calling her name since the first drop of blood hit the mud. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, the kind of smell that clung to the back of Maggie's throat like a bad memory. She moved slow, boots sinking into the spongy ground, each step releasing a whisper of moisture from the moss beneath. The fog curled around her ankles, stubborn as a stray dog, refusing to lift even as the sun tried to burn through the canopy above. Maggie Calloway adjusted the strap of her pack, her slate-gray eyes scanning the gnarled trunks of the Kentucky wilderness. She was tracking something that didn't belong in these woods, a predator that defied the laws of the land she had walked since childhood. No tracks. Not a single broken twig, no crushed ferns, no disturbed patches of dirt where an animal should have dragged its weight. Just the unnatural stillness of a forest holding its breath. Maggie crouched, fingers brushing the damp needles, her mind racing through the possibilities. The predator had passed this way. She could taste it in the air, sharp and metallic, like blood left too long in a tin cup. But the ground lied. It was as if the creature moved an inch above the soil, or perhaps the forest itself was complicit in hiding its passage. She pressed onward, navigating the jagged ravines and tangled roots of the hollow, her shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing for a blow that hadn't landed yet. The deeper she ventured, the more the terrain seemed to resist her. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting into skeletal fingers that snagged at her flannel sleeves. A crow cawed from somewhere deep in the canopy, the sound raw and mocking. But Maggie didn't flinch. Crows didn't scare her. What scared her was the way the forest had gone quiet. A vacuum of sound that made the blood rushing in her ears sound like a distant river. She was looking for a sign, any sign, that the natural order still held sway. But the silence was absolute, heavy, and growing. Then she saw it. The calf lay sprawled in the clearing, legs splayed at unnatural angles, ribs caved in like a crushed barrel. It was a Hereford, or what was left of one, its white face stained by the muck of the forest floor. Maggie's stomach twisted as she approached. Flies should have been thick as smoke over the carcass by now. Maggots should have been writhing in the open wounds, and the stench of decay should have been staggering. But the flesh stayed pristine, untouched, as if the scavengers had taken one look and decided this kill wasn't for them. The absence of typical predatory feeding patterns was the loudest warning yet. Coyotes would have torn the belly. A bear would have dragged it to a cache. This animal had simply been discarded, Maggie knelt, pressing 2 fingers to the calf's muzzle. Still warm. Too warm. The heat radiated from the hide in a way that felt feverish, an internal burn that had nothing to do with the sun. She shifted her weight, her boots squelching in the mire, and reached for the animal's head. She needed to see the damage, to understand the method of the kill. When she turned the heavy skull toward the light, her breath hitched. The animal's eyes were gone. In their place sat two smooth, polished black stones, tucked into the sockets with a jeweler's precision. She reached out, her calloused thumb brushing the surface of the right stone. It wasn't cold like a river pebble. It felt dense, vibrating with a frequency that made her teeth ache. There were no jagged edges, no signs of a struggle or a frantic carving. It was as if the eyes had simply transformed or been replaced by something that didn't belong to the world of biology. Maggie pulled her hand back, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't the work of a stray wolf or a mountain lion. This was deliberate. It was a message written in meat and stone, left in the heart of the hollow for her to find. Just as she began to stand, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew dense, the humidity spiking until it felt like she was breathing through a wet cloth. A heavy, unnatural silence fell over the clearing, more profound than the absence of birdsong. It was a physical weight that pressed against her eardrums. Then came the vibration. It started in the soles of her boots, a rhythmic, bone-deep thumping that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the mountain. It wasn't an earthquake. It was too regular, too much like a slow, labored heartbeat. The ground beneath the dead calf pulsed in time with the sound, and Maggie felt the vibration travel up her spine, rattling her skull. She didn't waste time wondering. Maggie reached into her pack and pulled out her thermal imaging unit, the plastic casing scarred from years of hard use. She clicked it on, the screen flickering to life in a wash of grainy blues and greens. She panned the clearing, expecting to see the hot orange bloom of a hidden watcher or the lingering heat trail of a predator. But the screen showed nothing but cold. The forest was a graveyard of blue. Even the calf, which felt warm to her touch, registered as a frigid void on the display. There was no biological heat anywhere within the frame, as if the mountain had sucked the thermal energy right out of the air. The suppression of the ecosystem was total. Maggie stared at the screen, her brow furrowed, the jagged scar on her cheek pulling tight. The lack of heat signatures meant that whatever was out there, whatever was causing that rhythmic pulse, wasn't alive in any way her equipment could recognize. It was a supernatural void, a cold spot in the middle of a Kentucky summer. She felt the locket around her neck, her mother's silver locket, growing cold against her skin. She rolled it between her fingers, a nervous habit she couldn't break, and whispered a prayer she didn't quite believe in. A twig snapped behind her, but it wasn't the light crack of a deer. It was the heavy, deliberate crunch of a man who had lost his way. Miller emerged from the undergrowth, his hulking frame casting a distorted shadow across the clearing. His denim jacket was torn, his eyes bloodshot and darting with a frantic, wild energy. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week, his skin the color of ash and his knuckles split from some unseen labor. He was muttering to himself, a low, gravelly stream of nonsense that broke through the oppressive quiet. When he saw Maggie, he froze, his jaw working as if he were trying to chew the air. "You," he croaked, his voice a jagged ruin. "You brought it. The Callaways, always bringing the dark down on us." Maggie stood slowly, her hands open and away from her belt. "Miller, you need to calm down. Look at me. It's Maggie. We need to get you out of here." But Miller wasn't listening. The silence had done something to his mind, stripped away the layers of the bully and left only the raw, trembling animal beneath. He let out a guttural roar, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, and lunged. He didn't move like a man. He moved like a landslide, all brute force and momentum. Maggie ducked, her boots sliding in the mud, but Miller was fast. He caught her shoulder, his massive fingers digging into her muscle with a strength born of psychosis. They went down together, crashing into the slick, black mud beside the dead Hereford. The brawl was brutal and chaotic. Miller was a man driven by a manic frenzy, his movements erratic and powerful. He swung wild, his fists connecting with the soft earth in Maggie's ribs. She gasped, the air leaving her lungs in a sharp burst, but she didn't panic. She had been in scraps before, and she knew that a man in a frenzy was a man who didn't guard his vitals. She twisted in his grip, her flannel shirt tearing as she drove an elbow into his temple. Miller grunted, his weight shifting, and Maggie used the momentum to roll him over. They wrestled in the mire, the scent of wet earth and copper filling Maggie's senses. The rhythmic thumping from the ground seemed to grow louder with every strike, a drumbeat for their struggle. Miller clawed at her face, his nails catching the edge of her old scar. But Maggie didn't flinch. She grabbed his wrists, pinning them to the mud, and used her knees to anchor his hips. She was smaller, but she was precise. She waited for him to heave upward, then shifted her weight, slamming her forehead into the bridge of his nose. The crack was sickeningly loud in the quiet forest. Miller went limp for a second, the fight draining out of him as the shock set in. Maggie didn't hesitate. She pulled a length of paracord from her pocket and worked with practiced efficiency, binding his wrists behind his back. She hauled him toward a nearby oak, propping him against the trunk. Miller was sobbing now, great, heaving sounds that shook his thick chest. But the madness had receded into a dull, hollow exhaustion. Maggie stood over him, her chest heaving, wiping the mud and blood from her brow. She had secured the perimeter, but the victory felt hollow. "It's talkin', Maggie," Miller whispered, his head lolling against the bark. "Can't you hear it? It's callin' for the blood." She didn't answer. A low whistle echoed through the trees, a signal she recognized. A moment later, Deputy Silas stepped into the clearing, his faded brown uniform damp with mist. He took in the scene, the dead calf, the bound farmer, the mud-caked woman, and didn't say a word. He just adjusted his hat, pulling it a fraction lower over his watery blue eyes. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had seen too much and said too little. "Found him wandering near the creek," Silas said, his voice a measured drawl. "Thought he might have come this way." "You okay, Maggie?" "I'm fine," she snapped, though her ribs ached with every breath. "Help me with him. We need to get him back to town before the others start looking for him." Silas nodded, his long, arthritic fingers steady as he checked Miller's bonds. Together, they established a defensive perimeter, Silas watching the tree line with his rifle cradled in his arms while Maggie returned to the kill site. She felt a pull, a magnetic tug that she couldn't ignore. She began to sweep the area near the calf's head, her fingers sifting through the damp leaves and pine needles. Something glinted in the muck, a dull, silver flash that didn't belong to the forest. She reached down and pulled a heavy, brass-cased object from the mud. It was a compass, old and tarnished. The glass cracked across the face. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the scrollwork on the lid, the way the hinge was slightly bent. It was her father's compass, the one he'd carried the day he walked into the woods and never came back. She wiped the grime away with her thumb and watched the needle. It didn't point north. It didn't even waver. The needle was pinned, pointing with unwavering intensity toward the dark, jagged silhouette of the mountain peak. "Silas," she called out, her voice barely a whisper. "Look at this." The deputy approached, his eyes narrowing as he saw the device. "That's your daddy's. I ain't seen that in 12 years, Maggie. Where'd you find it?" "Right here, under the head." She showed him the needle. "It's not north. It's the mountain. It's like it's being pulled. The environmental disturbance was no longer a theory. It was a physical reality. The mountain was exerting a force that defied the Earth's magnetic poles. Maggie felt the weight of her father's legacy settle on her shoulders, heavier than her pack. She looked back at the calf, at the black stones she had removed and placed in a specimen bag. She pulled the bag out, the stones clinking together. In the dim light of the overcast afternoon, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The stones weren't stones. They were translucent in the centers, a dark, amber-like material that revealed a network of pulsing veins. As she watched, the stones throbbed. They were organic, calcified growths, living tissue that had hardened into the shape of minerals. She could feel a faint, rhythmic heartbeat through the plastic, a tiny echo of the great thumping that was still vibrating through the ground. They weren't inanimate. They were biological entities, parasites or seeds. And they were alive. "They're breathing, Silas," Maggie said, her voice trembling for the first time. "The mountain's growing things." Silas looked at the bag, then out at the forest. The townspeople were already on edge, the rumors of the silence spreading like a fever through the hollow. He knew what this would do to them. The breakdown of social order was imminent. They could already hear the distant sounds of shouting from the direction of the main road, the panic of a community that realized they were trapped in a place that had stopped following the rules of God and nature. "We gotta move," Silas said, his hand tightening on his rifle. "The hollow's waking up, Maggie, and I don't think it's gonna be friendly." The trek back toward the valley was a blur of gray mist and jagged shadows. Maggie led the way, the bone compass in her pocket feeling like a hot coal against her thigh. The storm was coming. She could feel the drop in pressure, the way the wind began to howl through the high ridges, carrying the scent of ozone and wet stone. By the time they reached the outskirts of the town, the first heavy drops of rain were beginning to fall, lashing the Kentucky hills with a violent intensity. Maggie left Silas to handle the growing crowd of panicked locals and retreated to her family cabin. It was a weather-beaten log structure, tucked so deep into the woods that it felt like an extension of the trees. She secured the perimeter, slamming the heavy oak door and sliding the iron bolt into place. The wind hammered against the slate roof, the sound like 1,000 tiny fists trying to break through. She was isolated here, cut off from the town by the rising creek and the worsening weather. But it was the only place she felt she could think. She paced the small, single room, the floorboards groaning under her boots. Her father had always told her that the cabin was built on a strong point, a place where the mountain's voice was quietest. She didn't feel quiet. She felt the vibration in her teeth. She began to tear the place apart, driven by a sudden, desperate intuition. She moved the heavy, threadbare rug near the fireplace, exposing the packed earth floor and the rough-hewn planks. There, a loose board tucked beneath the shadow of the wood stove. Maggie pried it up with her knife, her fingers trembling. Beneath the floorboards sat a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it out, the fabric stiff with age and dust. Inside were 3 leather-bound journals, their covers scarred and stained. She opened the first one, the pages filled with her grandfather's frantic, looping script. She sat at the wooden table, the light of a single candle flickering as she began to read. The journals spoke of the seal of the warden, a burden passed from father to daughter, a duty to keep the mountain's hunger contained. It wasn't a myth. It was a job. Every 25 years, a sacrifice of blood and will was required to renew the barrier that kept the silence from consuming the valley. Her grandfather had done it. Her father had been tasked with it. And as she checked the dates, her heart froze. The deadline wasn't next month or next week. The 25-year window closed at dawn on this very night. "No," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the roar of the wind. "Not tonight." She checked her watch. It was nearly midnight. She had only a few hours to reach the ritual site, the Devil's Throat cave system, and complete whatever her father had started. But as she stood to gather her gear, the cabin's power flickered once, twice, and then died. The darkness that rushed in wasn't empty. Maggie watched, her breath hitching, as the shadows on the walls began to detach themselves. They didn't move with the flickering candlelight. They moved with a purpose of their own, sliding across the logs like ink in water. The darkness had become physical. It was hostile, reacting to her discovery of the journals as if the house itself were trying to keep its secrets. Maggie backed away, her hand finding the hilt of her skinning knife. The shadows pooled on the floor, rising into jagged, amorphous shapes that blocked the door. And then, the radio on the counter, a battery-operated unit that hadn't worked in years, began to crackle. "Maggie? Baby, is that you?" The voice was thin, layered with static, but Maggie would have known it anywhere. It was her mother. The woman who had disappeared into the radio static 20 years ago, leaving Maggie with nothing but a silver locket and a lifetime of questions. "Mom," Maggie whispered, her fingers flying to the locket. "It's so cold, Maggie. Help me. I'm in the dark. Come find me, baby. Just open the door." Maggie froze. Her mother was dead. She knew it in her bones, had known it since the night the radio cut out. This wasn't her mother. It was a deceptive auditory hallucination, a trick of the mountain designed to lure her into the shadows. She gritted her teeth, the scar on her face burning. "You ain't her," she growled, her voice a whip crack in the dark. "She never called me baby. She called me Mags." The voice cut off into a high-pitched shriek of static that made Maggie's ears bleed. She didn't wait for the shadows to close in. She grabbed her pack and her father's gear, diving through the small window in the loft and tumbling into the rain-soaked grass. She needed her supplies from the equipment shed, a small structure 50 yards from the cabin. She ran through the downpour, the mud sucking at her boots, her lungs burning with the cold air. She reached the shed and fumbled with the padlock, her hands slick with rain. As the door swung open, she stopped. The darkness inside was breathing. A dozen pairs of eyes reflected the dim light, glowing with a sickly, blue-green bioluminescence. They weren't coyotes. Not anymore. Their bodies were stretched, their limbs too long, their jaws distended and filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. They moved without making a sound, a pack of silent, mutated predators that had been waiting for her. They had infected the local wildlife, turning the scavengers into extensions of the corruption. The lead coyote lunged, a blur of matted fur and black ichor. Maggie didn't have time to draw her gun. She met the beast's charge with her skinning knife, the blade sinking into the creature's neck. It didn't howl. It didn't even whimper. It just collapsed, a thick, black liquid spraying across Maggie's flannel shirt. It wasn't blood. It was a foul-smelling sludge that hissed as it hit the floor. She was surrounded. The pack was closing in, their movements fluid and terrifyingly fast. Maggie backed toward a shelf of old supplies, her hand finding a flare gun and a gallon of kerosene. She didn't think. She acted on pure survival instinct. She kicked the kerosene jug over, the fuel spreading across the floorboards, and fired the flare into the center of the spill. A wall of fire erupted, the heat so intense it singed Maggie's eyebrows. The mutated coyotes recoiled, the light and heat driving them back into the shadows of the woods. They couldn't stand the fire. It was anathema to the cold, damp corruption of the mountain. Maggie used the distraction to bolt for her old Jeep, the engine roaring to life on the third try. She didn't look back as she drove toward the high ridges, the mud-caked tires spinning as she fought for traction. As she drove, she reached for the final journal, the one she had tucked into her jacket. She flipped to the last page, the ink fresh as if it had been written yesterday. "I am the anchor," the entry read. "The seal requires a living heart to beat against the silence. I will not be coming home, Maggie. But I will be waiting. Look for the throat. Look for the man who didn't leave." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't deserted them. He hadn't run off with another woman or lost his mind in the woods. He was the warden. He had sacrificed his life, his identity, and his family to power the failing seal. He was still alive, magically bound within the mountain, his life force the only thing standing between the hollow and the darkness. "I'm coming, Daddy," she whispered, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. The ascent was a nightmare. The main access road had been obliterated by a massive mudslide, a river of sludge and uprooted trees that blocked the path to the town. Maggie was completely cut off, trapped between the rising storm and the jagged peaks. She abandoned the Jeep and began to climb on foot, her climbing gear clinking against her belt. The wind began to articulate her name, a distorted, multi-tonal chorus that sounded like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "Maggie, Maggie, Maggie." She heard Silas. She heard Miller. She heard her grandfather. They were all blending into a predatory sound, a psychic tracking system that the silence was using to find her. She ignored the voices, focusing on the rhythmic thumping that was now loud enough to shake the trees. She was close. She could feel the magnetic pull of the compass in her pocket, the needle spinning wildly as she approached the entrance to the Devil's Throat. But she wasn't alone. Miller was there, leading a mob of terrified, armed townspeople. They had followed her, their fear turned to a sharp, jagged anger. They held torches that flickered in the rain, their faces twisted with a desperate, violent paranoia. "There she is!" Miller screamed, pointing a rusted shotgun at her. "She's the one. The Callaways kept the devil in the mountain, and now she's waking it up. Kill her, and maybe it'll stop." Maggie didn't try to argue. There was no reasoning with a mob driven by supernatural terror. She utilized every ounce of her tracking expertise, vanishing into the dense undergrowth just as a volley of gunfire tore through the leaves where she had been standing. She used the blinding rain and the steep terrain to her advantage, circling behind the mob and climbing higher, her fingers bleeding as she clawed at the black rock. She reached the entrance of the Devil's Throat, a gaping, jagged maw in the side of the mountain. The limestone walls were covered in the pulsing black stones, thousands of them, vibrating in perfect synchronization with her own heartbeat. It was a biological alarm system, and as she stepped inside, the vibration intensified, a deafening hum that made her vision blur. The cave was a labyrinth of wet stone and glowing slime. Maggie moved deeper, her thermal gear showing nothing but the cold, dead blue of the cavern. And then she saw herself. A shimmering, amorphous entity stood in the center of the chamber. It didn't have a face at first, just a shifting mass of shadows. But as Maggie watched, it began to mimic her physical form. It grew hair the color of midnight. It developed the sharp angles of her face, and it even recreated the jagged scar on her cheek. It was a perfect, silent double, a creature designed to replace her in reality, to take her place in the world while she became the mountain's fuel. The struggle was unlike any fight Maggie had ever known. When she struck the entity, she felt the pain in her own ribs. When she kicked its legs, her own knees buckled. It was a lethal test of endurance, a hand-to-hand battle against her own shadow. They wrestled on the slick stone floor, the entity's movements fluid and soulless. Maggie was losing strength, her heart hammering against the mountain's pulse. She remembered the compass. She pulled it out, the needle pointing directly at the entity's chest. Not at its heart, but at a magnetic anomaly buried within the shadow. She reached into her belt and pulled a steel piton, driving it with a heavy hammer blow into the cave floor at the focal point of the anomaly. The disruption was instantaneous. The shadow creature let out a silent scream, its form dissolving into a cloud of black vapor. The pain in Maggie's body vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow ache. She had won the fight, but the mountain wasn't finished. A sudden, violent tremor shook the cavern, the ceiling buckling and collapsing behind her. Tons of limestone crashed down, sealing the entrance and trapping her in the dark. She was buried alive. Maggie navigated the pitch-black tunnels, her thermal gear finally picking up a faint, ghostly heat signature deep in the heart of the mountain. She followed it to a hidden chamber, where a skeletal figure sat upon a stone throne. The remains were draped in a tattered wool coat, and pinned to the chest was the warden's crest, a silver circle with a line through it. "Daddy," she breathed, kneeling before the bones. She found a final inscription carved into the wall beside the throne, written in her father's hand. "I held it as long as I could. The seal is a heart. It needs a new beat. Don't be afraid, Maggie. The mountain is just a house. You're the one who keeps the door shut." The ground began to drain her strength, the rock itself feeling soft and hungry beneath her boots. The mountain was a sentient parasite, a geological entity that had been feeding on the townspeople's fear and her father's life force for a generation. Maggie felt the darkness beginning to dissolve her identity, the weight of the mountain pressing down on her soul. But she was a Calloway, and Calloways knew how to build. She used her knowledge of cave acoustics, her fingers finding a specific limestone vein that resonated with the mountain's rhythmic heartbeat. She didn't fight the hunger with force. She used her climbing hammer to strike the vein in a counter-rhythm, a steady, defiant beat that disrupted the supernatural pulse. The energy flow between the mountain and the black stones throughout the valley began to falter. A final vision flooded her mind. She saw her ancestors, a long line of jagged-faced men and women who had stood in this dark place. They weren't victims of a curse. They were the jailers of a global cataclysm. The mountain was a cage for something far worse than the silence, and her family was the only thing keeping the bars from breaking. Maggie stopped resisting. She opened her mind to the ancient, cold intelligence of the Kentucky wilderness, inviting the mountain's consciousness into her own. She felt her skin begin to calcify, her flesh turning into the same hard black stone that lined the walls. She wasn't dying. She was transforming. She was becoming the new warden. She merged her heartbeat with the mountain's pulse, a perfect synchronization that stabilized the hunger. The oppressive silence lifted instantly across the valley. In the town below, Miller dropped his shotgun, the paranoia vanishing from his eyes. Silas looked up at the peaks, a profound sense of peace settling over him. Maggie Calloway was gone. Her mortal life, her flannel shirt, her silver locket, they were relics of a woman who no longer existed. She was now an eternal echo, a spirit woven into the very structure of the devil's throat. She watched over the hollow from the shadows, her presence a benevolent watchfulness that guarded the hills from the darkness beneath. The natural sounds of the forest returned, the crickets, the owls, the rustle of the wind through the pines. The townspeople woke to a peaceful morning, finding only a discarded tracking vest near the sealed entrance of the cave. They would never know the price of their safety, but they felt the change. The hollow was quiet, but it was no longer silent. Maggie remained, the living seal, the heart that beat against the dark. She was the mountain, and the mountain was her. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't running. She was home.